A car just rolled off a production line in China running on a battery that most of the auto industry insisted was still a decade away from being real. Not a prototype, not a concept car sitting under studio lights at an auto show. A real mass-produced electric vehicle that customers can actually buy, powered by a battery that contains zero lithium. The element doing all the work instead is sodium, the same stuff sitting in your kitchen salt. Shaker right now. And the reaction from American battery experts and automakers has been somewhere between disbelief and genuine alarm. Today we are breaking down exactly what this battery is, how a Chinese company pulled this off years ahead of schedule, and why people in Detroit and Silicon Valley are suddenly paying very close attention to a chemistry almost nobody was taking seriously 18 months ago. If stories like this get your attention, tap that like button before we get into it. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them, and subscribe so you catch the next one. Let's get into it. The company behind this is CATL, and if that name is not familiar to you yet, it should be. CATL is the largest battery manufacturer on the entire planet, supplying cells to Tesla, BMW, Hyundai, Toyota, and most of the other car brands you could name off the top of your head. This is not some scrappy startup chasing headlines with a flashy announcement. This is the single most dominant player in the global battery industry, and when a company that size makes a bet this big, the rest of the industry cannot afford to ignore it. The bet itself is called Naxtra, CATL's sodium-ion battery platform, and the backstory behind it stretches back further than most people realize. CATL actually began researching sodium-ion chemistry all the way back in 2016, treating it at first as a long-term side project rather than a core priority. In 2021, the company unveiled its first-generation sodium cell, delivering a modest energy density of around 160 watt-hours per kilogram, promising on paper, but nowhere near good enough to compete with lithium in a real car. Then, in April of last year, everything changed. CATL announced that Naxtra was ready, not as a lab demonstration, but as an actual product moving into large-scale manufacturing. By the middle of this year, the promise turned into a real car on real roads, the Chang'an Nevo A06, developed in partnership with Chang'an Automobile, becoming the world's first mass-produced passenger electric vehicle running on sodium-ion cells. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what lithium has meant to the electric vehicle industry for the past 3 decades, and why cracks have been quietly forming underneath that dominance for years. Lithium earned its place at the top of the battery world because it does 2 things exceptionally well. Its particles are small and light, which lets manufacturers pack enormous amounts of energy into a compact T-space, and it has a strong natural tendency to push electricity through a circuit efficiently. Those 2 properties combine to make lithium batteries dramatically more powerful than anything that came before them. And for 30 years, nothing else came close to challenging that dominance. But being unchallenged for that long created its own kind of blind spot. The entire industry kept building on the same foundation, pouring in more investment, refining the same chemistry, and largely ignoring the warning signs stacking up underneath it. Those warning signs were real, and they were serious. Lithium batteries carry a genuine fire risk, something that became impossible to ignore after several high-profile battery fire incidents involving major consumer electronics brands over the years. Incidents that cost billions of dollars and permanently damaged public trust in the chemistry's safety margins. Cold weather is another brutal weakness. When temperatures drop below freezing, a typical lithium battery can lose somewhere between 20 and 40% of its usable range, which, for an EV owner in Chicago, Toronto, or northern China during winter, can mean losing well over 100 kilometers of driving distance on the exact mornings they need it most. And then there is the supply chain problem, arguably the most serious issue of all. Lithium raw material prices have swung wildly over the past several years, at one point rising by a factor of 8 in just 2 years, only to later crash by more than 70% within 12 months. Building the foundation of the clean energy transition on top of a commodity that behaves that unpredictably left automakers and governments deeply exposed to forces completely outside their control. Sodium, sitting quietly 1 row below lithium on the periodic table, had actually been explored as a battery material since the 1960s, long before lithium ever took over. It never had a real shot at competing, though, because sodium particles are roughly 35% larger than lithium particles, and for decades, nobody could find a storage material that could hold particles that size without physically breaking down after just a few hundred charge cycles. That single material science problem kept sodium sitting on a shelf for more than 40 years, dismissed as an interesting but ultimately impractical alternative. The breakthrough that changed everything came from a form of carbon called hard carbon, first identified in research back in the year 2000. Unlike the neatly ordered, evenly spaced graphite used inside lithium batteries, hard carbon has a chaotic, irregular internal structure, full of tiny pockets and gaps of varying sizes. That messiness turned out to be exactly what sodium needed, providing enough room for the larger particles to move in and out without damaging the material around them. The discovery sat in academic journals for over 2 decades without attracting serious commercial investment, mostly because lithium was working well enough that almost nobody felt urgency to look elsewhere. CATL changed that, committing roughly $1.4 billion over a decade, specifically to turn this laboratory curiosity into something that could actually be manufactured reliably at massive industrial scale, solving engineering problems along the way, including moisture control inside the porous material, gas buildup during charging, and getting the internal pore sizes precise enough to store useful amounts of energy without wasting space. So what does the finished product actually deliver? The Naxtra battery currently achieves an energy density of about 175 watt-hours per kilogram, which puts it roughly on par with lithium iron phosphate, the popular budget-friendly lithium chemistry that companies like BYD have used to power millions of affordable electric vehicles. In the Chang'an Nevo A06, that translates into a real-world range of around 400 kilometers on China's testing cycle, with CATL already targeting 500 to 600 kilometers in the next generation of the technology as the surrounding supply chain matures. Charging speed is genuinely impressive too, with the battery capable of reaching an 80% charge in around 15 minutes under the right conditions. Cold weather is where sodium genuinely leaves lithium behind, and this is not a small marginal improvement. CATL's sodium cells are designed to operate reliably across a temperature range, stretching from negative 40 degrees Celsius all the way up to 70 degrees Celsius. At negative 40 degrees, the battery still retains more than 90% of its usable capacity, an almost unbelievable figure compared to a lithium pack, losing a third of its range in the exact same conditions. Discharge power at negative 30 degrees Celsius is reportedly 3 times higher than what a comparable lithium iron phosphate battery can manage. For anyone living through a real winter in the American Midwest, across Canada, or through northern China, that difference is not a spec sheet curiosity. It is the difference between an electric car that actually works on the coldest morning of the year and one that leaves you stranded with far less range than you planned for. Safety is another area where sodium pulls ahead in a meaningful way. CATL's Naxtra battery became the first sodium-ion battery in the world to pass China's strict new GB 38031 or 2025 traction battery safety standard, a certification that includes brutal mechanical abuse tests like needle penetration, designed specifically to trigger thermal runaway in a battery pack. Naxtra reportedly passed with no smoke and no fire, a genuinely significant result given how much public anxiety still exists around lithium battery fire risk in electric vehicles and consumer electronics alike. Then there's the number that should make anyone in the battery industry sit up straight, the price, because sodium is more than 1,000 times more abundant than lithium, cobalt, or nickel, found dissolved in seawater and sitting in the ground. Almost everywhere on the planet, production costs come in dramatically lower. CATL is targeting sodium-ion cells at somewhere around 30% cheaper than lithium iron phosphate, and some estimates put the raw production cost gap even wider, potentially 70 to 90% below traditional lithium-ion. Chemistry is once manufacturing fully scales. Unlike lithium, whose supply is concentrated in a small handful of countries and subject to wild price swings driven by geopolitics and speculation, sodium supply cannot realistically be cornered or manipulated by any single nation. For automakers trying to hit aggressive price targets on affordable EVs, and for governments trying to build energy independence that is not hostage to a volatile commodity market, that stability is worth just as much as the lower price tag itself. Now here is where the shock in America genuinely comes into focus. This whole story is being compared, quite seriously, to what industry watchers called the deepseek moment from the AI world. That jarring instant when a Chinese AI startup delivered performance rivaling America's best AI labs at a fraction of the assumed cost, forcing a complete recalibration of what everyone thought they knew about the AI race. CATL's sodium-ion breakthrough is triggering the exact same kind of recalibration inside the battery and EV industry. Western battery experts had broadly assumed sodium-ion technology would not be commercially viable in real passenger vehicles until sometime in the 2030s at the earliest. Solid-state batteries were supposed to be the next big leap everyone was waiting for, dominating headlines and investor pitch decks for years as the inevitable next chapter of EV technology. Instead, the world's largest battery maker quietly sidestepped that entire conversation and shipped something different, cheaper, and further along than almost anyone in the West expected to see this soon. American automakers and battery developers are not sitting still in response, and it is worth being clear about that. Companies in the United States are pursuing their own sodium-ion research programs, and other players inside China, including state-backed automotive groups, are racing to match CATL's numbers with competing prototypes, cells of their own. But the uncomfortable reality for Western manufacturers is one of timing and scale. CATL is not promising a future roadmap. It is already shipping gigawatt-hour scale production, already integrated into a real car on real roads, already backed by a decade of focused investment and manufacturing expertise that is extremely difficult to replicate quickly. Meanwhile, several prominent American electric vehicle companies are dealing with their own serious financial pressures, cutting workforce and betting their survival on cheaper models just to stay competitive in a market where Chinese manufacturers keep arriving with better economics seemingly every year. It would be dishonest, though, to pretend sodium is about to make lithium disappear entirely, and CATL itself is not even claiming that. Sodium particles are heavier and physically larger than lithium particles, which puts a hard ceiling on how much energy you can pack into a given weight. For application S, where every gram matters intensely, like electric aircraft or premium long-range vehicles chasing maximum range numbers, lithium chemistry is likely to remain the better choice for years to come. CATL has been explicit about pursuing what it calls a dual star strategy, developing sodium and lithium chemistries in parallel rather than trying to have one fully replace the other, deploying each battery type exactly where it performs best. Some of CATL's newer vehicle designs even split a single battery pack into two zones, one sodium and one lithium, letting software decide in real time which chemistry handles the load depending on temperature and driving conditions. Still, the scale of ambition here is genuinely hard to overstate. CATL's own chairman has projected that sodium-ion technology could eventually displace somewhere between 30 and 40% of the entire global battery market, a staggering claim from the company that currently supplies a massive share of the batteries powering electric vehicles worldwide. If even a fraction of that projection plays out, it represents one of the most significant shifts in the energy storage industry in decades, redrawing which countries and companies control the raw materials and manufacturing capacity behind the batteries the entire world increasingly depends on. It is also worth pointing out that CATL is not stopping at passenger cars. The company recently unveiled what it calls the world's first sodium-ion battery designed specifically for grid-scale energy storage, set for commercial deployment before the end of this year. That grid storage version carries an energy density of around 160 watt-hours per kilogram, a system efficiency of 97%, and a cycle life exceeding 15,000 full charge and discharge cycles, while still retaining 80% of its original capacity. This chemistry skips cobalt and nickel entirely and uses aluminum foil instead of copper internally, stripping out even more cost from the manufacturing process. When you combine that with the passenger vehicle rollout, CATL's roadmap for this year spans 4 completely different deployment categories at once: battery swapping stations, passenger vehicles, commercial trucks, and grid storage, all running on the same underlying sodium chemistry. That is not a company testing the waters with a niche product. That is a company betting an entire portfolio on a technology it believes is ready right now. CATL is also not the only Chinese company chasing this technology, which says something important about how seriously the entire domestic industry is taking sodium-ion chemistry. Beijing Automotive Group, the state-owned manufacturing giant that builds Hyundai's vehicles for the Chinese market, has its own competing sodium-ion program, well underway. Their prototype cell reportedly hits an energy density of 170 watt-hours per kilogram, supports rapid 4C fast charging, capable of reaching GA full charge in about 11 minutes, and delivers cold weather performance nearly identical to CATL's numbers, operating from -40 degrees up to 60 degrees Celsius, while holding more than 92% of its energy at -20 degrees. When you have 2 major Chinese manufacturers, not just one, independently reaching similar performance numbers around the same time, it stops looking like a single company's lucky breakthrough and starts looking like a genuine coordinated industrial shift happening across the entire Chinese battery sector simultaneously. It is worth being honest about the limits of what we know at this stage as well. Naxtra is genuinely new, and most of the performance numbers circulating right now come directly from CATL's own testing and press materials, rather than years of independent real-world verification across millions of vehicles. Lithium batteries earn trust over 3 decades of actual road use in every climate, under every kind of abuse ordinary drivers put a car through. Sodium-ion batteries in passenger. Cars are only just beginning that same process now, and it will take time before we know exactly how these packs perform after 5 years of daily charging, extreme heat, and the countless small stresses a real car battery experiences over its lifetime that a lab environment simply cannot fully replicate. That does not diminish how impressive the underlying breakthrough is, but it is worth keeping in mind before assuming every spec sheet number translates perfectly into years of flawless real-world performance. What makes this moment particularly striking from an American perspective? is not just the technology itself, but the pattern it represents. This is not the first time in recent memory that a Chinese company has quietly worked on something for years, largely ignored by Western media and analysts, only to suddenly emerge with a finished, deployable product that outpaces the assumed timeline by several years. When that pattern repeats across different industries, first with advanced AI models, now with battery chemistry, it starts to raise a much bigger question about how well Western companies and analysts are actually tracking what is happening inside China's research and manufacturing pipelines, versus how much they are simply assuming the old order of technological leadership will hold indefinitely. Whether that gap closes quickly or lingers for years, the direction it points in is already clear enough to make plenty of people in this industry rethink assumptions they were confident about just 12 months ago. So here's the real question worth sitting with. For years, the assumption in Western boardrooms was that China would eventually catch up to the rest of the world in advanced battery technology. What just happened with sodium-ion batteries suggests the opposite. Might be closer to the truth, that China did not catch up, it got there first, and the rest of the industry is now scrambling to understand a technology curve it did not see building this quickly. If a sodium-powered electric car cost significantly less than a comparable lithium vehicle and simply worked better through a real winter, would that change your mind about buying one? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how people feel about this. If this video gave you something new to think about, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, because this industry is clearly moving faster than most people outside it realize. We will see you in the next one.